Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we're going to be discussing the Rambam Hilchos Esuri Bia Perek Tezvav Halacha Aleph. The Rambam talks about the status of a Mamzer. Mamzer is someone who was born out of a incestuous or adulterous relationship. Unlike in America, when they use the word for a illegitimate child born out of wedlock, that's not what a Mamzer is. A Mamzer is someone born through a relationship that was either adulterous or incestuous. So, Ezuhu Mamzer, the Rambam asks, what is the Mamzer that the Torah speaks about? What is it that makes the person a Mamzer? This is one who is a product of one of the forbidden relationships. And then he says that when a person aval haba al shar harayis bein ba'inus bein beratzim bein bezadin bein bishgaga hablad mamzer, that in any of these forbidden relationships, if the relationship occurred, whether it was ba'inus, coercion, whether it was done willingly, whether it was done deliberately, whether it was done unintentionally, in any of those cases, hablad mamzer, the child is considered a mamzer, even if it happened against the will of the person. So the Einig Yontif, Siman Kuf Chaf Aleph, raises a question. First of all, where's the source for this psak of the Rambam, that even ba'inus, even if it was done ba'inus, where there is no punishment whatsoever, there's no sin whatsoever, because the person was forced into it, so why would the child be a mamzer? So the Einig Yontif brings a makar, a source from the Gemara in Chagiga. There the Mishnah talks about how it's possible to mu'uvis layichel liskain, that you did something wrong and you can't correct it. What's the example? The Mishnah says, person who has relationships with a forbidden person, the child that is born is a mamzer. You can't correct that. So the Gemara says, why does it talk about that the child is a mamzer? That's why you can't correct it. If it's a case of adultery, then the woman is forbidden to her husband. That's the effect that would apply. So the Gemara answers, it depends. If the person was forced into it, it doesn't affect the relationship with the husband. But it does affect the status of the child as a mamzer. So the Unigantiv says, well, the Gemara is talking about a case where someone coerces a woman into a forbidden relationship. What about if both are einus? If both have been forced into it, in that case, do we also say that the child is a mamzer? The argument against that is that if there's no aveira, if there's no transgression, then why would the product be a mamzer? And he brings a Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Daf Nun Daled. If a person worships an animal, that animal becomes forbidden to be used. It's called nevad. What happens if the person was coerced into it and he was forced to bow down to his own animal? So from the Gemara it emerges that if there would be no transgression whatsoever, then everyone would agree that the animal does not become forbidden. So what we see from this Gemara is that if there's no aveira, if there's no sin, if there's no transgression, then the product, the effect, isn't there. Then the animal is not forbidden. It's not considered nevad. So by the same token, the Einig Yontif argues, if both parties were involved in this relationship through coercion, there was no desire whatsoever, and the person is exempted from punishment, even though when it comes to the three cardinal sins, one has to give his life, but there are cases where, according to one opinion, that if it's done b'tzina, it was done in secrecy, in privacy, no one was around, you don't have to give your life. So in the case where a person was coerced into having this relationship, there is no transgression. If there's no transgression, why should the child be a mamzer? So originally, I thought there could be an answer that, based on one of the approaches to einus. Why is an einus pater? Is it because the act is not considered an act of an aveira? Or is it because it doesn't accrue to you? It's not your aveira. It was the aveira of the person who forced you. So the liability, although you did the aveira, the liability goes to the one who forced you, not to the person who was being forced. If that's the case, then we can understand the difference between the case of einus by arayis and einus by nevad. Because in the case of nevad, someone forces the Jew to worship this animal. So who does the sin apply to? It applies to the person who did the coercion, but he can't make it forbidden because it's not his animal. Whereas in the case of arayas, if someone was coerced into this relationship, it is ascribed to the person who coerced you. If it's ascribed to the person who coerced you, then it's still considered a forbidden relationship. What's the difference? Who was the one involved in this erva? It's still traceable to the person who did the coercion. But that's not a good enough answer, because in that case it would depend on whether the person who coerced you was a Jew, in which case the child would be a mamzer. But if it was a non-Jew who has an adulterous relationship with a Jewish woman, even though it's obviously forbidden, the child, the halacha is not a mamzer. So there would have to be a distinction drawn, and we don't find any such distinction. But I think the difference between the case of nevad and the case of mamzer is that they're talking about two kinds of transgressions. Nevad is not based on a mitzias, on a reality, on a fact. It's based on a kavana. Yes, it has to come through an act, but it's still based on your kavana. You want to worship this animal. So in that case, if there's no avera, if there's no transgression because it was done through coercion and the person was not liable for it, why should that coerced intention, coerced action have any deleterious effect? Why should it lead to the animal becoming forbidden? Whereas in the case of mamzer, the prohibition is based on a mitzias, is based on a reality. Whenever there's a forbidden relationship that carries the penalty of karis or more, then the product is a mamzer. It's not based on what you intended to do. It's based on a reality, a mitzias. The halacha is based on the mitzias. So therefore, who cares if it was done by einus or beratzon, if it was done through coercion or not? This relationship did happen. It's a factual relationship, a physical relationship that carries within it a certain effect, a negative effect of the child being a mamzer. Just to conclude on a positive note, our sages tell us that when Mashiach comes, the mamzer's status will be rectified. And the Medrash speaks about how the mamzer complains to God, it's not my fault that I'm a mamzer. It's the fault of the parents who engage in an illicit relationship. But God's response is that when Mashiach will come, that status of mamzer will be reversed.